What if everything you thought you knew about the crucifixion was incomplete? What if there was a sacred secret, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, that reveals something extraordinary that happened at the very moment Christ died? Picture this. While the world mourned and darkness covered the land, two of heaven's mightiest archangels were carrying out a divine mission so profound, so sacred, that only one ancient church dared preserve the account. This isn't a story you'll find in your Bible. It's not taught in Sunday school or preached from most pulpits. Yet it holds the key to understanding why one African nation became Christianity its most devoted guardian, and why their faith runs deeper than almost anywhere else on earth. Deep in the Ethiopian highlands, where the air is thin and ancient monasteries cling to cliffsides like eagles' nests, monks have guarded a secret for nearly 2 millennia. For Ethiopian Christians, this is living history that pulses through their worship, their art, their very identity as a people chosen by God. When they gather for their ancient liturgy conducted in Ge'ez, with melodies that haven't changed since the 4th century, they remember not just Christ's sacrifice, but the angels who ensured that sacrifice would reach their homeland in the most sacred way possible. When they pray before icons painted on monastery walls, when they trace the sign of the cross over their hearts, with movements passed down through 100 generations, they participate in a mystery that connects them directly to Golgotha. These holy men, with their flowing robes and weathered faces lined by decades of prayer, possess manuscripts written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that died out everywhere else centuries ago. In their careful script, illuminated with gold leaf and precious pigments, they record events that Western Christianity forgot or never knew existed. They trace their spiritual lineage not merely to the Ethiopian eunuch baptized by Philip in Acts 8:39, though that connection remains precious to them. They point to something far more profound, a direct sanctification of their land by the blood of Christ himself, carried on angels' wings while the Savior still hung dying on the cross. None suspected that while they focused on earthly drama, supernatural forces were converging on that small hill outside Jerusalem's walls. They couldn't perceive the angels gathering in the spiritual realm, invisible to human senses, but blazing with divine purpose and holy anticipation. You must enter a world where angels walk among men, where divine blood sanctifies entire nations, and where the crucifixion becomes not just humanity as redemption, but the beginning of a sacred mission that continues to this day. You must suspend your Western rationalism and enter the mystical worldview of ancient Africa, where the spiritual and physical realms interweave like threads in a cosmic tapestry. While other nations received Christianity through missionaries, through conquering armies, through gradual cultural conversion, Ethiopia claims to have been chosen and sanctified at the very moment of Christ's crucifixion. While others trace their Christian heritage to human apostles and evangelists, Ethiopians point to archangels as their founders. The religious leaders believed they were silencing a troublemaker who threatened their carefully maintained relationship with occupying forces. But that changed the spiritual landscape of an entire continent. This is the mystery of why Ethiopia's churches overflow with images of angels bearing cups of sacred blood, why their communion celebrates not just remembrance, but active participation in a divine mission that began 2 millennia ago and continues until Christ returns. The crowds, many of whom had shouted Hosanna just days earlier, assumed they were witnessing another crucifixion in Rome's long catalog of public executions designed to maintain order through terror. While Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, wept at the foot of the cross, while John, the beloved disciple, stood witness to his master's agony, while Roman centurions maintained their professional indifference, and religious authorities savored their victory, supernatural forces were converging on Golgotha with purposes that transcended human understanding. While other churches developed their traditions through centuries of theological development, Ethiopian Orthodoxy claims its core mysteries were established by divine revelation at Calvary itself. This claim, audacious by any standard, forms the bedrock of Ethiopian Christian identity. They tell of things that happened at Calvary, which would reshape your understanding of Christ's sacrifice forever. You know about the nails that pierced Christ's hands and feet, about the crown of thorns that cut his brow, about the mockery of soldiers casting lots for his seamless garment. You know about the darkness that fell from noon until 3 in the afternoon, about the temple veil that tore from top to bottom, about the earthquake that shook the foundations of Jerusalem. But you've never heard about what Archangel Uriel did with his luminous wings in those final moments, or how Archangel Michael joined him in a mission that would echo through centuries. You've then never been told about the chalice of celestial fire that appeared at the foot of the cross, invisible to human eyes, but blazing with divine purpose. In the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly from volcanic stone in the 12th century to recreate Jerusalem in the heart of Africa, you can still see the evidence painted on ancient walls. Images of angels with wings stained crimson, holding vessels that gleam with inner light. Depictions of celestial beings kneeling at the foot of the cross, while Roman soldiers remain oblivious to their presence. These aren't artistic fantasies or theological abstractions. For Ethiopian Orthodox believers, these paintings record actual historical events witnessed by angels and preserved through divine revelation. You've probably heard countless sermons about the cross. This isn't mythology or folklore concocted by imaginative theologians seeking to add drama to familiar stories. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, known in their language as Tewahedo, claims apostolic succession, not just through human bishops, but through angelic intervention. Consider the implications. The Roman soldiers thought they were executing another criminal that Friday afternoon, the 15th day of Nisan in the year that would later be calculated as 33 Anno Domini. None of them realized they were present at a cosmic event that would span continents and centuries, involving beings of pure light carrying out orders from the throne of heaven itself. To understand this hidden chapter of the Passion, you must journey beyond the familiar Gospels into ancient traditions, preserved by one of Christianity's oldest and most isolated communities. The story begins, as all the greatest mysteries do, with what human eyes could not see. This is their story. This is the account of what happened when heaven intervened at Calvary in ways that human witnesses never recorded. The morning of that fateful Friday began like any other in Jerusalem during Passover week. The city swelled with pilgrims from across the Roman Empire, their voices creating a babel of languages as they conducted business, sought lodging, and prepared for sacred observances. Merchants hawked their wares in narrow streets barely wide enough for loaded donkeys to pass. Angels who had sung at creation, who had announced Christ's birth to shepherds in Bethlehem fields, who had ministered to Jesus during his 40 days of temptation in the wilderness, now received their most solemn assignment. The weight of this divine mission pressed upon the spiritual realm with an intensity that made the very foundations of heaven tremble with anticipation. Temple priests maintained their schedules of sacrifice and ritual, the smoke from countless offerings rising toward heaven in familiar patterns that had persisted for centuries. Roman soldiers, hardened by years of maintaining order in this fractious province, went about their duties with professional efficiency. They had crucified hundreds before this day, and would crucify hundreds more before their tours of duty ended. For them, this was simply another execution of another Jewish troublemaker who had attracted too much attention from the wrong people. Some followed out of curiosity, drawn by the spectacle of Roman justice being enacted. Others came to mock, their hearts hardened by religious pride and political expedience. Still others trailed behind in grief, unable to believe that the one who had raised their dead, healed their sick, and proclaimed good news to the poor was now stumbling under the weight of a Roman cross. Mary of Magdala, from whom 7 demons had been cast out, pressed through the throng with tears streaming down her face, and rain, dotted with caves and crevices that gave it a skull-like appearance when viewed from certain angles. Roman engineers had chosen this location for executions precisely because of its visibility from multiple approaches to the city. They wanted their message of power and consequence to be unmistakable to anyone entering or leaving Jerusalem. She had seen Jesus restore sight to the blind, cause the lame to walk, and speak words that transformed hearts harder than stone. His mind reeled with memories of Jesus calming storms with a word, multiplying bread and fish to feed thousands, raising Lazarus from a tomb where decay had already begun its work. Dark patches in the rock marked where blood had soaked into limestone. Grooves worn by countless feet showed where crowds had gathered to witness Rome's ultimate expression of authority. Post holes drilled into the rock provided anchoring points for crosses, their edges worn smooth by rope and wood and the weight of dying men. How could this same Jesus, who had demonstrated power over nature itself, now appear so helpless in the hands of Roman executioners? Jesus' mother Mary, sustained by John's strong arm, gazed upon her son with a mixture of anguish and faith that defied human comprehension. She had treasured the angel's words at the Annunciation, had pondered the shepherd's testimony after Jesus' birth, had marveled at his wisdom, even as a 12-year-old boy in the temple. Now she watched as prophecies she had never fully understood came to their terrible fulfillment. 3 crosses would rise that day, one for Jesus of Nazareth, and 2 for common thieves whose crimes merited death under Roman law. Their presence provided a stark contrast to the absence of most male disciples, who had fled in fear when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane's garden. These women, who had experienced Jesus' transformative power in their own lives, refused to abandon him even in his darkest hour. Soldiers stripped the condemned, laid them upon wooden crossbeams, and drove iron spikes through wrists and feet with efficient brutality. They raised the crosses and dropped them into prepared holes with jarring impact that sent shockwaves of agony through already tortured bodies. They divided the victims' possessions among themselves and settled down to wait for death to complete their work. Religious leaders arrived early to ensure they could witness the death of the one they considered a blasphemer and threat to public order. Roman officials took their positions to oversee the execution and maintain order among the spectators. Curious onlookers, drawn by the spectacle of public death, jostled for the best viewing positions. Angels who had worshipped around God's throne since before time began received commands that would test their obedience to limits they had never imagined. Archangels whose very presence could cause mountains to melt like wax, prepared for a mission that would require them to witness the death of the one they had adored throughout eternity. The soldiers measured distances, checked anchor points, and prepared the instruments of torture that would transform living men into public examples of imperial power. Now she watched in anguish as the one who had given her life meaning and purpose was led away to die like a common criminal. An unusual stillness seemed to settle over the hill, as if creation itself held its breath in anticipation. Birds that normally scavenged around execution sites flew away and did not return. Dogs that typically prowled the area in hopes of scraps retreated to the city below. Even the wind, which usually swept across the exposed hilltop with relentless persistence, seemed to die away into expectant silence. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, cosmic forces were aligning for the most significant event in human history. As the sun climbed higher over Jerusalem's ancient walls, casting long shadows through the city's winding streets, a procession formed that would carry the Son of God to his appointed place of sacrifice. But never before had these ancient stones observed anything approaching the cosmic significance of this particular Friday morning. As the procession reached the city's outskirts and began climbing the small hill that would forever be known as the Place of the Skull, forces both seen and unseen converged on this unremarkable piece of ground outside Jerusalem's walls. But this Friday would be different from every other Friday in human history. This Friday, the eternal Son of God would taste death for every person who had ever lived or would ever live. This Friday, justice and mercy would meet at a wooden cross planted on a hill called Golgotha. This Friday, angels would weep and demons would flee as the very foundations of creation groaned under the weight of humanity's sin being transferred to the one person capable of bearing it. The procession moved slowly through Jerusalem's streets, gathering crowds as it progressed toward the city gates. Among the crowd walked individuals whose names would never be recorded in human histories, but whose presence that day held eternal significance. John, the beloved disciple who had leaned against Jesus' chest at the Last Supper just hours before, struggled to process what was unfolding before his eyes. The path to Golgotha wound through Jerusalem's narrow streets and out through gates that had witnessed countless processions over centuries of occupation and conflict. Golgotha itself appeared utterly ordinary to casual observers. A low hill of weathered limestone, scarred by wind, the hill bore the stains and scars of countless previous crucifixions. As the soldiers reached the execution site, they began their grim preparations with practiced efficiency. Yet something was different about this execution from all others. The crowd that gathered represented a cross-section of Jerusalem society and the wider Roman world. Among them stood those whose hearts broke as they watched the unfolding tragedy. Mary Magdalene, Salome, and the other women who had followed Jesus throughout his ministry pressed as close to the crosses as Roman guards would allow. The actual crucifixion proceeded according to Roman procedure, refined through centuries of practice. But as Jesus hung between heaven and earth on that instrument of torture, forces invisible to human perception began gathering with intensity that made the spiritual realm quake with anticipation. The stage was set for an intervention that would forever change how one ancient nation understood its relationship to the crucified Christ. In the celestial realm, where beings of pure light move according to divine purposes beyond human comprehension, two magnificent archangels received summons that would forever alter their eternal service. Uriel, whose very name means fire of God or light of the Lord, had served as heaven's illuminator since before the foundations of the world were laid. His role throughout history had been to reveal divine mysteries, to interpret God's will to prophets. Ancient texts speak of wings that blazed with inner fire, of eyes that held the intensity of stars being born, of a countenance that reflected the very glory of God's throne. He bore himself with the dignity of one who had witnessed creation's first moments, who had watched as divine breath transformed dust into living souls, who had stood guard at Eden's gates after humanity's fall into sin and death. And seers, and to carry the flame of heavenly knowledge into the darkest corners of spiritual ignorance. While Michael earned recognition as heaven's warrior and Gabriel became known as God's herald, Uriel operated in the shadows of divine revelation, his mighty works known primarily to those who delve deepest into sacred mysteries. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, however, preserved full knowledge of his significance and celebrated his role in their nation's spiritual heritage, and whose very existence served as an eternal answer to that rhetorical question. No created being could compare to the Almighty, and Michael, as absolute loyalty to divine sovereignty, had earned him the position of heaven as supreme military commander. His sword, forged in the fires of heaven's throne, had never known defeat in combat against evil. His armor, crafted from celestial materials unknown to earthly science, bore the marks of countless battles fought on behalf of those who called upon the name of the Lord. His wings, when spread to their full span, could cover nations and provide shelter for the righteous in times of divine judgment. His battles against the forces of darkness had raged since Lucifer's rebellion, and his victories had protected God's people throughout every generation of human history. The command came directly from the throne of God, bypassing all intermediate authorities and messengers. Its urgency demanded immediate action, yet its eternal implications required perfect execution. This was no ordinary blood, though it flowed through veins and arteries like any human circulation. This blood carried the genetic heritage of Mary's humanity and the divine nature of the eternal Son. Blood and water flowed from the wound, medically confirming that death had indeed occurred. But in the spiritual realm, this flow represented something infinitely more significant than proof of physical death. They stood invisible to human perception, their celestial forms occupying the same physical space as ordinary matter, while remaining completely undetectable to earthly senses. They watched as the procession climbed the hill, as the crosses were raised, as Jesus spoke his 7 final words from the instrument of his torture. The timing had to be perfect, coordinated with divine precision to capture the sacred essence while it retained its full spiritual potency. They carried with them a chalice unlike anything that had ever existed in the material world, a vessel forged from celestial fire and fashioned according to specifications known only to God himself. Its capacity seemed infinite despite its modest appearance, reflecting the paradoxes that characterize all things touched by divine infinity. Most importantly, it had been consecrated specifically for this moment, blessed and prepared to receive the most sacred substance that would ever exist in creation. Angels who had maintained vigil throughout the crucifixion began to move with purposes that had been held in suspension for 3 hours of supernatural darkness. The moment for action had arrived, and heaven's most trusted messengers prepared to fulfill their divine commission. It represented the release of salvation's source into the world. Satan himself, though defeated by Christ's perfect obedience unto death, retained enough power to cause havoc, if not carefully restrained. Demonic entities who had celebrated humanity's fall into sin now watched in horror, as their victory was transformed into ultimate defeat through divine sacrifice. Even archangels who dwelt constantly in God's presence experienced overwhelming awe when confronted with the magnitude of what Christ had accomplished through his sacrificial death. The being who hung lifeless on that Roman cross was the same one who had spoken creation into existence, who had walked with Adam in Eden's garden. The blood that had already begun to flow from the soldier's spear thrust represented more than biological fluid ceasing to circulate through a dying body. It represented the precious commodity for which this entire cosmic drama had been orchestrated, the payment for sin that would satisfy divine justice while demonstrating divine love beyond human comprehension, who had appeared to Abraham as one of 3 mysterious visitors who had wrestled with Jacob by the Jabbok River. It had never been contaminated by sin as corruption, because the one from whom it flowed had never transgressed God's perfect law. It represented the ultimate sacrifice for sin, the complete payment for humanity's debt to divine justice. No margin for error existed in this divine mission, for it would establish spiritual connections that would endure until the end of time itself. They operated as perfectly harmonized instruments of divine will, each complementing the other's unique gifts in service to purposes that spanned eternity. Where Uriel brought illumination and revelation, Michael provided protection and enforcement. Where Michael's justice might seem overwhelming to human frailty, Uriel's wisdom provided understanding and hope. Uriel's appearance defied human description, as do all beings who dwell in the immediate presence of the Almighty. They had stood side by side as cherubim guarded the way to the tree of life. They had coordinated heaven's response during the great flood, ensuring Noah's family and the animals would survive to repopulate the earth. They had witnessed the calling of Abram, the exodus from Egypt, the establishment of David's kingdom, and the construction of Solomon's temple. Throughout the centuries since Adam's expulsion from paradise, Uriel had served as God's messenger to chosen individuals during history's most critical moments. He had appeared to Enoch to reveal the secrets of heaven and earth. He had visited Ezra to interpret visions of the future that human minds could barely grasp. He had illuminated the understanding of mystics and prophets whose writings would guide generations of believers through spiritual darkness toward divine light. Yet despite his crucial role in God's unfolding plan of redemption, Uriel remained largely hidden from mainstream religious consciousness. Standing beside Uriel in heaven's throne room was Michael, the archangel whose name means, "Who is like God?" Michael's appearance radiated the terrible beauty of divine justice, perfectly balanced with infinite mercy. The relationship between these 2 mighty archangels transcended human concepts of friendship or partnership. Throughout the ages, they had worked together during history's most pivotal moments. Now, as Jesus hung dying on Golgotha's cross, these 2 archangels received the most significant assignment in their eternal careers. The assignment centered on a single, precious substance, the blood flowing from Christ's pierced side. When the Roman soldier thrust his spear into Jesus' side, fulfilling ancient prophecies written centuries before that moment, he unknowingly participated in a cosmic event that would reverberate through eternity. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, preserved in ancient manuscripts and oral teachings passed down through countless generations, Uriel and Michael had been positioned at Golgotha long before Jesus arrived. But their mission required them to act at the precise moment when life departed from Christ's physical form. This chalice blazed with inner light that made the sun appear dim by comparison. Its substance transcended physical matter while remaining capable of containing liquid elements. As Jesus breathed his last and cried out, "It is finished," the spiritual atmosphere around Golgotha erupted with activity invisible to human observers. Uriel approached the cross with reverence that bordered on terror. With movements that reflected both urgency and infinite care, Uriel extended one magnificent wing toward the wound in Christ's side. Michael stood ready to assist, his warrior's instincts focused on protecting this sacred mission from any interference by forces of darkness that might seek to disrupt God's plan. The blood collection began with movements so gentle they barely disturbed the air around the cross, yet so purposeful they set in motion events that would echo through millennia and across continents. The moment Uriel's luminous wing touched the sacred blood flowing from Christ's pierced side, the very fabric of creation seemed to shudder with recognition of this unprecedented act. Never before in the history of heaven and earth had angel wings been permitted to make contact with divine bloodshed for humanity's redemption. This was not merely a collection of physical substance, but a transmission of spiritual essence that would carry salvation's power across geographical boundaries and through generations yet unborn. Each drop carried within it the full weight of divine love expressed through perfect sacrifice, the complete satisfaction of justice demands, and the infinite mercy of God extending forgiveness to a fallen world. Ancient homilies speak of Uriel's wing becoming clothed in crimson glory and adorned with the jewels of redemption. They tell of light so brilliant emanating from the collected blood that Michael had to shield his eyes, despite his eternal residence in the blazing presence of God's sea throne. They describe fragrances more beautiful than all the flowers of paradise rising from the sacred substance as it filled the chalice of celestial fire. Demonic forces, realizing that their apparent victory over God's Son was transforming into their ultimate defeat, marshaled every remaining resource in desperate attempts to disrupt the redemption process. They could not prevent Christ's death, for his willing sacrifice fulfilled prophetic requirements established before the world began. But they hoped to interfere with the distribution of salvation's benefits to humanity. As the precious fluid touched angelic substance, it seemed to sing with harmonies that existed before music was created, vibrating with frequencies that resonated through every dimension of reality. His authority over angelic hierarchies, both faithful and fallen, remained absolute under divine mandate. When lesser demons approached the sacred scene, hoping to corrupt or contaminate the blood collection, Michael's mere glance sent them fleeing into outer darkness. According to ancient traditions preserved in Gia's manuscripts, God had designated the Ethiopian highlands as holy ground before Abraham received his call to leave Mesopotamia, before Moses led Israel out of Egyptian bondage, before David established his kingdom in Jerusalem. The timing of the blood collection and its subsequent transportation to African soil represented the fulfillment of divine purposes that had been planned from eternity. They claim legitimacy based on divine selection expressed through the most sacred possible means, the blood of Christ himself, carried by archangels to sanctify their homeland. This understanding shapes every aspect of their worship, their theology, and their identity as a people chosen by God for special purposes in his eternal plan. They had observed the Son of God voluntarily submitting to death for the sake of creatures who had rebelled against their Creator. They had watched as infinite love expressed itself through ultimate sacrifice, as perfect justice was satisfied through divine mercy. They understood that they bore within their custody not merely symbolic elements, but actual components of humanity's redemption. The blood in their chalice represented the difference between eternal salvation and eternal condemnation for millions of souls who would live and die on African soil over the coming centuries. Of all the countless angels who served in heaven's courts, they too had been selected for the most significant mission in celestial history since the incarnation itself. They would be the instruments through which Christ's sacrifice reached beyond the borders of Palestine to touch a continent that would become one of Christianity's most faithful guardians. Uriel and Michael prepared to spread their magnificent wings and embark upon a flight that would carry them from Jerusalem, starkened skies, to the high plateau of ancient Ethiopia. As the separation between God and humanity was bridged through the body and blood of the one who partook of both divine and human nature. Then, with movements that embodied both infinite grace and irresistible power, they spread their wings and prepared to leave Golgotha for the ancient highlands of Ethiopia. Before them lay a journey across landscapes, both physical and spiritual, a flight that would conclude with the sanctification of an entire nation through the most precious substance ever to exist in creation. Uriel wept as he performed his assigned task, his tears mixing with the sacred blood in the chalice of light. These were not tears of sorrow for Christ's suffering, though the archangel felt that pain with intensity that would have destroyed any lesser being. The blood they collected would not merely serve as a memorial to Christ's sacrifice, but as a spiritual foundation for one of Christianity's most enduring strongholds. Ethiopia would become a nation where faith survived centuries of Islamic expansion, where ancient Christian traditions were preserved during periods when they were forgotten elsewhere, where biblical manuscripts were protected when libraries burned throughout the rest of the Christian world. The blood collection was only the beginning of their divine assignment. Ethiopian Orthodox teaching emphasizes that God's purposes for this sacred substance extended far beyond its immediate collection. The blood in their celestial vessel was destined for a specific geographical location and a particular people who had been chosen for blessing in ways they could never have imagined. These were tears of joy for the magnificent demonstration of divine love that the crucifixion represented, and for the privilege of participating in its extension to nations that had never heard the name of Jesus. When more powerful principalities dared to challenge the mission, his sword blazed with fire that consumed their very essence, reminding all observers that God's purposes would not be thwarted by created beings who had chosen rebellion over obedience. The blood that adhered to Uriel's celestial feathers glowed with an inner radiance that outshone the sun hanging dimly in the darkened sky above Golgotha. Michael's role in this divine assignment proved equally crucial, though expressed through different actions. While Uriel collected the blood with tender reverence befitting its infinite value, Michael maintained vigilant guard against any force that might seek to interfere with this sacred work. His sword remained drawn throughout the entire process, its blade reflecting light that revealed the presence of spiritual entities invisible to human perception. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition describes this moment with language that stretches human vocabulary to its absolute limits. But this was not a solitary mission accomplished by Uriel alone. A spiritual warfare raging around Golgotha during those hours exceeded anything witnessed since Satan's original rebellion in heaven. Michael's presence ensured that no such interference would succeed. Yet the most remarkable aspect of this celestial operation was not the power it displayed, but the love it demonstrated. As the chalice filled with its precious contents, both angels began to sense the approach of their next phase of operations. The selection of Ethiopia for this supernatural sanctification did not occur randomly or as an afterthought to the main drama of salvation. Uriel and Michael understood that their mission carried implications extending far beyond the immediate moment. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church today traces its spiritual authority not merely to apostolic succession through human bishops, but to this direct angelic intervention at Calvary. As the final drops of sacred blood settled into the chalice of celestial fire, both angels paused to contemplate the magnitude of what they had witnessed and participated in. The weight of their responsibility in carrying this sacred substance to its appointed destination pressed upon them with force that would have crushed any lesser beings. Yet alongside this overwhelming responsibility came indescribable privilege. The time had come to begin their journey. With the precious blood secured in their chalice of light, with their divine mission, clearly understood with the weight of eternal purposes resting upon their celestial shoulders behind them, human witnesses continued their vigil at the foot of the cross, unaware that they had just observed the beginning of a supernatural mission that would establish spiritual connections, spanning continents and lasting until the end of time. The angels exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words, each understanding perfectly his role in what was to come. With wings that spanned distances impossible to measure in earthly terms, Uriel and Michael rose from Golgotha's blood-stained ground into the darkened sky above Jerusalem. Their ascent created no disturbance in the natural world perceptible to human senses. Yet their departure marked the beginning of a journey that would forever alter the spiritual landscape of northeastern Africa. The chalice of celestial fire, cradled securely between them, pulsed with divine radiance that illuminated their path through dimensions invisible to mortal eyes. Their flight path did not follow the trade routes that connected Jerusalem to the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia, nor did it trace the geographical features that guided earthly travelers across the Arabian Peninsula and through the Horn of Africa. Angels move according to spiritual coordinates that transcend physical geography, following trajectories determined by divine purposes rather than earthly logistics. They soared through heavenly realms where distance is measured not in miles, but in spiritual significance, where time moves according to eternal rhythms rather than temporal sequences. Ancient hermits living in cave monasteries reported unusual lights moving across the night sky, following patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than natural phenomena. Wild animals normally aggressive toward human presence became docile and peaceful, as if sensing the approach of beings whose very presence sanctified the atmosphere around them. According to preserved accounts, they landed initially on Mount Sukwala, a volcanic peak rising more than 9,000 feet above sea level in what would later become the Shua region. This location was not chosen arbitrarily, but represented the geographical and spiritual center of the territory God had designated for special blessing. Each drop that touched the earth created a point of sanctification that would endure throughout all future generations. The blood did not simply soak into soil as ordinary liquid would, but penetrated the very essence of the land, transforming it into holy ground comparable to the temple in Jerusalem or the mountain where Moses received the law. They visited sites where great monasteries would eventually rise, where churches would be carved from solid rock, where kings would establish their capitals and rule according to Christian principles. Each location received its measure of sacred blood. Each was blessed with angelic presence. Each was designated for specific purposes in God's unfolding plan for the African continent. His sword traced invisible boundaries that would shield these holy places from corruption by evil forces, creating zones of divine presence that would serve as refuges for faithful believers and centers for worship and spiritual growth. The 11 churches carved from solid volcanic rock in the late 12th and early 13th centuries would serve as testament to the spiritual power concentrated in that region through angelic intervention at the very moment of Christ's crucifixion. These protective barriers would prove crucial during later centuries when Islamic expansion threatened Christian communities throughout the region. Uriel blessed the site where one of Africa's most ancient monasteries would maintain continuous worship and biblical scholarship through centuries of isolation from the outside world. The manuscripts preserved there would include texts lost everywhere else in the Christian world, saved by divine protection established through angelic intervention. Their chalice seemed to contain an inexhaustible supply of sacred blood, refilling itself through miraculous means that defied natural laws. Each site they blessed became a point of spiritual light that would shine throughout future centuries. Attracting seekers of God's springs of fresh water began flowing in places where none had existed before, providing life-sustaining resources for future monastic communities. Caves suitable for hermitages appeared in cliff faces that had been solid rock. The chalice between them had emptied its contents across hundreds of miles of African landscape, establishing a network of holy sites connected by invisible threads of divine blessing. Their mission was complete, but its effects would continue reverberating through history until the end of time. Flat areas perfect for church construction formed on mountain peaks previously too rugged for building. The very geography of the region rearranged itself to accommodate the spiritual purposes for which it had been chosen. They would develop forms of worship, art, and architecture that reflected their special relationship with the crucified Christ. They would produce saints, scholars, and spiritual leaders whose influence would extend far beyond the borders of their homeland. And crimson that seemed to reflect the sacred blood now mingled with the earth, Uriel and Michael prepared for their return to heaven. Their empty chalice blazed with residual glory from its sacred contents, its celestial fire now permanently kindled with light drawn from Christ's sacrifice. Their mission had been accomplished with precision that satisfied divine requirements and established foundations that would endure for millennia. All of this would flow from the night when 2 archangels carried the blood of Christ across continents and poured it out on African soil, and serving as a foundation for Christian civilization in the heart of Africa. They had established spiritual foundations that would enable Ethiopian Christianity to develop unique characteristics distinguishing it from Christian communities elsewhere in the world. Ethiopian Orthodox believers would possess a confidence in their divine election that sustained them through centuries of persecution, isolation, and attempted conquest. And the Indian Ocean. Michael established protections that would preserve Christian rulership, even when surrounding kingdoms fell to Islamic conquest. The massive granite obelisks still standing there today mark the location where angelic swords created spiritual fortifications that endured for more than 15 centuries. As they flew southward from Palestine, the landscape below them told the story of human civilization's rise and fall across millennia. They passed over the ruins of ancient cities whose names had been forgotten by history, over trade routes that had carried commerce and culture, between Africa, Asia, and Europe for thousands of years, over oases where prophets had received visions, and kings had made decisions that shaped the destiny of nations. The Red Sea, which Moses had parted centuries earlier to lead Israel out of Egyptian bondage, sparkled beneath them like liquid jewels reflecting starlight. Its waters had witnessed miracles that demonstrated God's power over natural forces, had served as a highway for trade and cultural exchange between continents, had provided boundaries between kingdoms and empires throughout recorded history. Now it lay below two archangels carrying the most precious cargo ever transported across its shimmering surface. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition describes their arrival in the highlands of Abyssinia as accompanied by signs that only those with spiritual perception could recognize. The archangel's first action upon reaching Ethiopian soil involved a ritual of consecration that established spiritual foundations for everything that would follow. From their chalice of celestial fire, Uriel began the sacred work of dispensing Christ's blood across the Ethiopian landscape. Michael's role during this consecration process involved establishing spiritual protection around each sanctified site. The pattern of their sanctification work followed divine blueprint that would later become apparent through the locations where Christianity took deepest root in Ethiopian culture. At Lalibela, future site of the most remarkable church complex in Christian Africa, Uriel released drops of blood that would inspire King Lalibela 8 centuries later to attempt recreating Jerusalem in the Ethiopian highlands. At Agjum, ancient capital of a trading empire that connected Africa with the Mediterranean world, at Debre Damo perched impossibly on a flat-topped mountain, accessible only by rope. Throughout the night, the two archangels continued their work of sanctification, visiting location after location designated in divine plans formed before the world began. The Ethiopian highlands themselves seemed to respond to this supernatural consecration. As dawn approached, ending their night of sacred work, Uriel and Michael stood together on the summit of Mount Entoto, overlooking the valley where Ethiopia's future capital of Addis Ababa would eventually rise. The transformation they had accomplished extended far beyond the physical sanctification of geographical locations. They would preserve ancient traditions and manuscripts that disappeared from other Christian centers. As the sun rose over the Ethiopian plateau, painting the mountains in shades of gold. The consequences of that miraculous night, when archangels carried Christ's blood to Ethiopian soil, continue reverberating through history nearly 2,000 years later. What began as an invisible supernatural mission has produced visible, lasting effects that distinguish Ethiopian Christianity from every other expression of faith in the world. The blood sanctification established by Uriel and Michael created spiritual foundations so powerful that they shaped not only religious practices, but entire civilizations, influencing everything from royal succession to artistic expression to theological understanding. Within centuries of the angelic visitation, Ethiopia became one of the first nations on earth to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion. This belief permeates every aspect of their religious identity, from their distinctive worship practices to their unique theological emphases, to their preservation of ancient traditions lost elsewhere in the Christian world. Ethiopian believers see themselves not as recipients of a foreign religion introduced by external evangelists, but as inheritors of a faith planted directly by heaven in their native soil. Throughout the country, in ancient rock-hewn churches and modern urban parishes alike, visitors encounter images that would seem strange to Christians from other traditions. Paintings and murals consistently depict Archangel Uriel holding a chalice filled with crimson liquid, his wings bearing traces of red that represent contact with Christ's blood. These are not merely symbolic representations, but historical records of actual events according to Ethiopian understanding. King Ezana's conversion in the 4th century Anno Domini was not merely a political decision influenced by international pressures or economic considerations. According to Ethiopian Orthodox understanding, it represented the natural flowering of seeds planted by angels at Calvary itself. Wall paintings show both Uriel and Michael at the foot of the cross during the crucifixion. Visitors who come expecting conventional Christian art find themselves confronted with images that tell a story unfamiliar to most of the world, as Christians yet central to Ethiopian Orthodox identity. While libraries burned and manuscripts were destroyed throughout much of the Christian world, Ethiopian monasteries maintained collections of biblical and theological texts that disappeared elsewhere. Their version of the Bible includes books considered apocryphal by other Christian churches, including detailed accounts of Uriel's activities that provide context for their unique traditions. The Book of Jubilees, which exists in complete form only in G.'s translation, provides additional background for understanding angelic involvement in human history. These and other texts preserved only in Ethiopia offer windows into early Christian understanding that were closed elsewhere through theological controversy and political pressure. During their celebration of the Eucharist, known as Kedis in G.'s, priests and congregants participate in what they believe to be continuation of the angelic mission that began at Golgotha. When they consecrate bread and wine to represent Christ's body and blood, they understand themselves to be joining the work that Uriel and Michael began when they collected sacred blood in their chalice of celestial fire. They make pilgrimages to sites where Uriel's blood sanctification is believed to have occurred, seeking healing, spiritual renewal, and deeper connection to their Christian heritage. They celebrate annual festivals commemorating the Archangel's arrival in their homeland, with ceremonies that blend ancient traditions with contemporary expressions of faith. While other African Christian communities submitted to European or Middle Eastern religious leadership, Ethiopian Orthodox churches maintained autonomous governance based on their claim to direct divine authorization. This independence proved crucial during centuries when colonialism threatened to overwhelm indigenous Christian traditions elsewhere in Africa. These are not recent additions to their liturgy, but ancient elements preserved from the earliest centuries of their Christian heritage. The Archangel, who remains unknown to most Christians, holds a position of honor in Ethiopian churches comparable to the veneration accorded to Mary, the mother of Jesus, or John the Baptist in other Christian traditions. They worship on ground sanctified by Christ's own blood, participate in liturgies established through angelic revelation, and inherit traditions preserved by supernatural protection. Their confidence in divine election sustains them through persecution. Their unique theological insights enrich global Christian understanding, and their preservation of ancient practices provides windows into Christianity's earliest expressions. Every time Ethiopian Christians gather for worship, every time they venerate icons showing angels with blood-stained wings, every time they celebrate communion, believing themselves connected directly to Calvary through angelic mediation, they participate in consequences of divine intervention that transformed their homeland into holy ground and established their nation as Christianity's most faithful guardian in the heart of Africa. Monasteries built on sites visited by Uriel and Michael during their night of consecration became centers of learning, worship, and spiritual power that attracted seekers from across the known world. Debre Damo, Debre Libanos, Dijon Mariam, and dozens of other monastic communities trace their foundations to divine selection rather than human planning. Their worship continues in Ge'ez rather than modern languages their calendar follows. Ancient calculations rather than Gregorian reforms, their fasting practices maintain rigor that exceeds most other Christian traditions. And their theological emphasis on divine mystery rather than rational explanation reflects wisdom preserved from earliest Christian centuries. The churches of Lalibela, carved entirely from solid rock in attempts to recreate the holy sites of Jerusalem, represent engineering accomplishments that continue baffling modern experts. Local tradition attributes their construction to angelic assistance, claiming that work accomplished during daylight hours by human laborers was completed during nighttime hours by supernatural helpers. What appeared to observers at Golgotha as simply another Roman execution was actually the launching point for supernatural missions that would establish Christian strongholds in regions where human missionaries had never traveled. The blood that seemed to flow uselessly into Palestinian soil was actually being collected by angels for distribution across continents and through centuries. The angels in these paintings are not passive observers of Christ as sacrifice, but active participants in extending its benefits to Ethiopian believers. The spiritual preparation accomplished through blood sanctification made Ethiopian soil uniquely receptive to Christian truth when human missionaries finally arrived. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church today, known in their ancient Ge'ez language as Tewahedo, meaning being made one, claims apostolic succession that extends beyond human ordination to include direct angelic authorization. Their priests and deacons trace their spiritual authority not only through bishops connected to early apostolic churches, but through the archangels who established their homeland as holy ground. This understanding provides Ethiopian Christians with confidence in their divine election that has sustained them through centuries of persecution, attempted conquest, and cultural pressure. Unlike Christian communities that developed gradually through missionary activity and cultural adaptation, Ethiopian Orthodoxy claims immediate divine establishment at the moment of Christ's sacrifice. The artistic expressions of Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity reflect this special relationship with the crucifixion and its angelic witnesses. In the magnificent churches of Lalibela, carved from solid volcanic rock during the 12th and 13th centuries to recreate Jerusalem in the heart of Africa, the liturgical practices of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church also reflect their unique understanding of angelic involvement in their spiritual heritage. Ethiopian Orthodox worship services include specific prayers and hymns that invoke Uriel's intercession and celebrate his role in their nation's sanctification. The preservation of ancient Christian texts and traditions in Ethiopia demonstrates the effectiveness of the spiritual protection established by Michael during that night of blood sanctification. The Book of Enoch, rejected by most Christian authorities as non-canonical, holds special significance in Ethiopian Orthodox theology because of its extensive descriptions of Uriel's role in revealing divine mysteries. Ethiopian monastic traditions also reflect the influence of angelic sanctification on their homeland's spiritual development. The architectural achievements of Ethiopian Christianity demonstrate the extraordinary spiritual energy concentrated in their sanctified homeland. Modern Ethiopian Orthodox believers continue practicing devotions that connect them directly to the angelic mission accomplished at Calvary. The Ethiopian Orthodox understanding of their spiritual heritage has enabled them to maintain independence from external ecclesiastical authorities throughout their history. Even today, as globalization pressures all traditional cultures to conform to international standards, Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity retains its distinctive character, rooted in the angelic sanctification of their homeland. The story of Uriel and Michael's mission to Ethiopia reveals how God's purposes extend beyond human perception and work through means that transcend ordinary historical processes. For Ethiopian Orthodox believers, this tradition provides assurance that their faith rests on foundations more solid than human institutions or cultural adaptations. The legacy of that miraculous night continues shaping Ethiopian Orthodox identity and practice today, nearly 2 millennia after Uriel and Michael completed their sacred mission.